without further ado, I would like to invite Garrett Craig to the stage. He is going to be our session facilitator. You may have recalled in our comments from the first session from John Neiman the importance of the National FFA here in Kansas. It's our opportunity to really educate and prepare the next generation workforce in agriculture. And Garrett is really one of our shining stars for that. He is a sophomore here at Kansas State University, and he has agreed to facilitate this next session. So I will invite Garrett.
Good morning. My name is Garrett Craig with the Kansas FFA Association, and I'm honored to be this morning's facilitator. I am a student here at Kansas State University, majoring in agricultural education, and I'm in the Kansas FFA National Officer Candidate. This session is focused on livelihoods and economic growth, which is important to focus on as we provide innovative solutions for sustainable livestock production and agri-food systems. To begin this session, we will have a brief introduction from our sponsor, the Global Dairy Platform, then hear from Shirley Tarawali as she presents the topic overview. The respondent, Jay Waldvogel, will then have his 10 minutes to give remarks. Then Nitya Gotej will then have 10 minutes to present her innovations in action. One final speaker, Juan Jose Molina, will then provide additional perspective. After our speakers have finished, questions that have been collected from the audience throughout the session, whether on paper or on the app, will then be put before the panel. Thank you for being in attendance. We look forward to having a great session, and I would now like to invite Donald Moore with the Global Dairy Platform for an introduction to this session.
Well, thank you, Garrett, and I'm back up here again. So for those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Donald Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform, and it's my pleasure and indeed privilege to provide a few comments to open this session this morning on livelihoods and economic growth. I want to start, though, by sharing some stats about the dairy sector with you. And some of the stats, I guess, are quite surprising for those of us who live in developed countries, but maybe not so surprising for those in developing countries. There are around 133 million dairy farms in the world. There are 600 million people living on those dairy farms who derive at least part of their livelihood from that dairy farm. If you then add into that 400 million people whose livelihoods depend upon dairy to some extent up and downstream from the farm itself, you've got about 1 billion people in the world who depend upon the dairy sector, the dairy industry, for at least part of their livelihood. Those stats all come from some work that was done by FAO a number of years ago, and so I think we're in the process of updating some of the issues around farm numbers, or some of the numbers on farms. But when you start to think about dairy farming, those of us who are based in the United States, or indeed I used to live in New Zealand and I originally came from the UK, or if you're from Europe, we tend to think of dairy farms as reasonably large-scale enterprises. In reality, the average dairy farm in the world is 2.9 cows. I'm not quite sure what 0.9 of a cow looks like, but they do tend to be relatively smaller enterprises, and often dairying is part of a mixed farming system where one part of the farm is producing crops, the byproduct from the crops is being fed to the dairy cows and converted into high quality protein, which helps to feed not just that family but also produces an income, a regular income on a daily basis to that family as well. So as representative of the dairy sector, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce this session. You may recall, for those of you who were in the audience last year, actually, we haven't done this yet. Hands up if this is your first GASL meeting. Okay, so the 5 of us who were at last year's, no, I'm joking. Hands up if this is not your first GASL meeting. Okay, so to be honest, for those of you who weren't looking behind you, we're about 20% of us who've been here before, 80% this is their first meeting. At last year's meeting, Ernesto Rios, who works with us in Global Dairy Platform, launched a paper on dairy and poverty. And copies of that paper are available from the FAO website to look at the role that dairy plays in reducing poverty around the world and improving economic livelihoods and outcomes for people in all segments of the world. So I'm very pleased that we have that report as well. This year, Ernesto will be releasing the next report in that series, which is about the role that dairy plays in reducing hunger. So it kind of fits into our first two discussions this morning. But anyway, Garrett, wherever you went, those were the comments I wanted to make in introducing it. We're very pleased to be a part of this meeting. And again, my compliments and thanks to both GASL and Kansas State for preparing such a fantastic meeting. So thank you, Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I would now like to invite Shirley Tarawali to the stage. Shirley Tarawali is the Assistant Director General at International Livestock Research Institute and Secretary to the ILRI Board of Trustees. Shirley received her PhD in plant science from Y College, University of London, England. She has also received her bachelor's degree. Well, excuse me, I have skipped. Shirley, oh, right there. Her bachelor's degree in biology from the University of York, United Kingdom. So with that, we will please welcome Shirley.
Thank you, Garrett, and a warm good morning to everybody. Because so many of us are quite familiar with the livestock sector in this room, not least it's Kansas, and we've come here to a livestock meeting. I've taken a bit of a different approach with this presentation, and I really hope that the co-authors of the paper will forgive me for anything I might have missed out there if it doesn't do justice to their contributions. Actually, only one of the co-authors, that's Ilsa, is actually here with us today. Let me also note that in this presentation, we're not going to say very much about the intersections with the other three topic domains that we'll be exploring during the course of this week. And to mention as well that part of the presentation is going to include a photo film, and I must credit that to my colleagues Susan Macmillan and David Mallowan, along with other colleagues, Paul Karimu, who's here with us today, David Aronson and Michael Victor. They've done a great job on that, as I think you'll agree. I wonder, actually, how many of us could say that livestock have in one way or another contributed to our livelihoods, perhaps during the course of this year, but my guess is that probably for every one of us, within the last 2 generations, you could say, yeah, livestock were there in some way or another. Certainly I can. My father worked on a farm. In fact, I grew up drinking unpasteurized milk. Sorry, Delia, wherever you are. And actually, I was the one who had to take the contaminated milk sample for the school biology lessons when I was in high school. I've seen the difference that livestock can make in the livelihoods of other people. At one time, I worked in northern Nigeria, and we wanted to meet with a group of women in the region we were working in, and along with a female colleague, we were actually not allowed to meet alone with that group of women. But 2 years later, those women were raising animals, they had started growing feed for the animals, and they had formed groups. And they would meet with any visitors that we happened to take along, and they would proudly show off a sewing machine or a pasta making machine or whatever it might be that they'd been able to buy with the proceeds of those livestock enterprises. I'm sure many of us have stories like that about livestock and livelihoods. Maybe you even come from a country whose economy depends in one way or another on livestock. So when we talk about this topic, livelihoods and economic growth, we often find lots and lots of good news. But it's good news that doesn't always get highlighted. It quite often gets missed out, especially outside of the sector itself. But when we take a look, we find in every corner of the world, in every country, in every environment, in every economy, that animals are being raised. They're being raised, as we just heard, for food, for nutrition. They've been raised for cropping, for incomes, for jobs and livelihoods. Being raised to support education, for insurance and security. and for equity for often some of the most vulnerable, women, children, and other marginalized groups. The ways we raise livestock are as diverse as we as people are across the world. And all of these systems matter. As you just heard from Donald, they matter for more than 1 billion people. They matter for national economies in many cases. Along with the other dimensions we're going to explore this week, food, health, nutrition, environment, they all rely on the world's living assets and how we use and care for them. And of course, with the demand for livestock-derived foods growing so quickly, that means there's lots of opportunities, many of them as yet unexplored and probably underfinanced as well, that could transform the sector into one that is fair as well as sustainable, one that is safe as well as profitable, one that is humane as well as efficient, one that meets that demand, contributes to development, and mitigates any harms from the sector. So what would that look like if we actually started to invest, we as a livestock community and the wider world, in this sector that could contribute so much to livelihoods and economic growth? And if we took as a starting point the diversity of the sector, what would that look like, and can we do it? Well, we already know something because there's a lot already going on. Let's take a look. I hope we're going to take a look. Hopefully, that's gotten us all excited about the potential for sustainable solutions to contribute to livelihoods and economic growth. So we might even ask, what's the problem? Is it about recognizing the diversity or taking these kinds of innovations to scale? And what do we need to do about that? In preparing the paper, we came up with 5 things that we thought would be important to consider in that regard. Let's see if we can go there. So let me just quickly run through those key messages. The first is about recognizing and supporting livestock's contribution to multiple development ambitions, and that sometimes there could be unintended consequences. That means we need to think about technologies, businesses, and infrastructure that support the growth of everything, from individual households through to national economies. It means we need to protect those livestock assets, whether through insurance or incentives or vaccination campaigns, perhaps. It means being deliberate about issues related to equity, men, women, young, old, large scale, small scale. It means harnessing diversity and growth for a sustainable livestock sector. It's not going to look the same everywhere for sure. So we need to prioritize and be targeted about smart investments, not having blanket policies, and recognizing there's sometimes short and long-term synergies and trade-offs. And support, in many cases, a transition from livelihoods dependent on livestock to those that have grown out of that dependence into other opportunities. It means we need to support sustainable enterprises through financing, business, trade opportunities, tailoring finance options so they don't prejudice some of the groups that are dependent on livestock for livelihoods today, addressing wider infrastructure issues so that some of these fancy mobile phone apps and what have you can work, and de-risking new investment for those for whom life is perhaps a little bit fragile at times. It means we need to invest and use the latest technologies at a faster pace. I like to call it innovation expedited, addressing that disparity between where the newest, latest, fanciest technologies perhaps are being developed and where demand is growing the fastest. And of course, supporting sustainable intensification, more efficient, less environmentally harmful production with good health outcomes that still supports many livelihoods. And to undertake awareness and engagement actions to make sure that livestock's roles in livelihoods and in economic growth are included in wider discussions on both livestock specific as well as other development challenges. That means a lot more dialogue and engagement within the sector, but especially outside. The global agenda itself is helping to foster that. And reconnecting livestock and the consumer, as we heard in the earlier session, is also important so that we can seek joint solutions. Finally, finding livestock in surprising places. That means being part of dialogues about health, about environment, about nutrition, where perhaps livestock don't always come to the fore. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tarawali. We now invite Mr. Jay Waldvogel to come to the stage. Jay Waldvogel is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Global Development for Dairy Farmers of America. Jay holds a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of Washington. Let's welcome Mr. Waldvogel.
Almost. University of Wisconsin. The other W. Thanks again, as others have said, the organizers for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be able to speak to you. I actually had thought about the deck before I got here. And having been at a GASL meeting in the past, I realized the depth of expertise, knowledge, and experience in this room. I anticipated that a lot of what I would talk about would be covered by people much smarter than me. And so I've decided to forgo slides and just talk and try and pick up on some of the issues that I've heard from the previous speaker, wonderful presentation from the previous speaker, as well as earlier in the sessions. So you won't get the benefit of any fancy slides, and you certainly won't get anything approaching that wonderful video that was shown earlier. I know that behind this depth of knowledge and expertise in the room, from my past experience at GASL meetings, there is also a very, very well-formed passion for our industry, passion for the livestock sector. But passion that doesn't start from the same place, and passion that doesn't necessarily pursue the same ends. But what I have found with this group is that passion is not the kind that pushes you off into a corner, that it causes you to hunker down and defend your own position, your own biases, but a passion that brings people to the center to have a conversation. And I'm looking forward to that conversation over the next couple of days, and to help you understand my starting point, my biases and my passions, a bit more of my personal background. Donald Moore introduced you to the Global Dairy Platform. I've been on the board of directors of GDP for a number of years. And I've been able to see how the dairy industry has actually addressed the issues that are facing the entire industry globally pre-competitively. Issues around how we define nutrition, issues around sustainability from the initial days when nobody knew exactly what it meant to the days now when everybody thinks they know exactly what it means, but it's different for everybody, even into dairy development, into messaging. I've seen how they've developed the tools and the stories to support the livestock sector, the dairy sector. I've been involved with the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, also a supporter and very active in this conference today and tomorrow, which has built upon those global platform issues, built upon the issues of nutrition, sustainability, but done it around the U.S. industry, built their own tools, built their own stories, built their own connections to consumers and policymakers. And I work for Dairy Farmers of America, a U.S. dairy cooperative owned by 8,000 farm families across the U.S. The definition of diverse. In those 8,000 farm families, we'll have farmers who milk literally a handful of cows, hundreds of farmers who will milk less than 20 cows who use little technology. But we'll also have farmers who milk tens of thousands of cows who use the most progressive technology available. In fact, you'll see those in the state of Kansas where we have members, literally farmers milking 50 cows and farmers milking 30,000 cows. So I believe in the power of the dairy industry, but perhaps even more importantly, I am the son of a dairy farmer. And I've milked cows, I've fed cows, I've plowed ground. So my passion lies very firmly in the fact that dairy, that livestock is a cornerstone of what we need in the world going forward. I freely admit those. And so I'll address the issues here, focus more on dairy than more broadly. In the case of ILRA, I was asked for two things to do for this. One was to respond to the paper, and later on to talk specifically about policies. And as is almost always the case with ILRA papers I've seen, it is very well written. If you haven't had the chance, I encourage you to take a look. Very thorough work, very complete. And so what I find myself doing more than anything else is reinforcing the issues you heard. But a couple of points where I maybe differ slightly. This issue of how many people are dependent upon livestock. Donald Moore talked about it specific to dairy. There are literally 1 billion people in the world today. Those 125 or 30 million dairy farmers, their family members, those 125 million jobs close in created by dairy, whether you're the veterinarian, the feed supplier, the tractor salesman, the trucker, the person who puts the milk into the jug, or the person who markets that milk, and their families. More than 1 billion people who go to bed tonight knowing that their livelihood, where they sleep, what they eat, is dependent upon dairy. It has to be dramatically higher than that when you extend yourself out to the wider livestock. We are important. We are here. Too often we look at it from the negative about what we do wrong and how we fix it, and we forget sometimes to talk about the positive, about what it is that the livestock sector, again in my case, what it is that dairy already brings and supports the world. I think sometimes that can get us into a negative defensive position. We are far from perfect. There is much we still have to do. Much of it is put on us because of situations around us, and we're responding to it. But don't for a second forget how important and impactful we are already today. Speaking specific to dairy, we are relevant in the context there are some 6 billion consumers every year who enjoy dairy in some way, shape, or form. And while we are diverse on our farm side, whether it's the farmer milking 1 or 2 cows or the farmer milking 100,000 cows, we are just as diverse on the product side. So you could be a consumer who gets that entry-level everyday nutrition, fundamental to whether it's your child's health or your own, or you be the consumer who enjoys the most highest functional product or the most indulgent product. We are very much in that sense, whether you talk about it from the farm side or the consumer side or everything in between, we are an inclusive end industry, and livestock across its broad range is the same. It adds a challenge to what we do. If you read the ILRI paper, you see the complexity of the solutions because of the complexity of the business. It's an important thing to keep in mind. We're also impactful. Donald mentioned the billion persons. But it's impactful not just in terms of the total number, not just in terms of the total economic size, but it's impactful for what it does to society, what it does for society. If you think about that as a cornerstone of rural society, of creating real food nutrition where it's needed, not simply producing in one place to consolidate and send out around the world, but every place where dairy exists, you have those pockets of economic growth. You have that stable, vibrant rural society. And you can see it here in the US, not just in developing countries. If you go where I live in the state of Wisconsin, you'll see communities built on the dairy business model. You'll see schools, you'll see businesses, you'll see infrastructure. You'll see a richness of an economy. Go to parts of the country that are based on a grain model, and increasingly you see emptying towns because the economy is so much thinner. In fact, the technology is available today. I could probably literally farm land in Illinois 300 or 400 or 500 miles from here, and I could do that simply from my laptop. Self-driving tractors, precision farming, data from the sky. That doesn't create the kind of sustainable economies and models and rural sustainability and rural vibrance that you look for in society. So dairy is impactful beyond just that billion-person number. And dairy is responsible. Again, lots of work to do. Nobody would suggest we're perfect. But if you look at the progress that dairy has made on the sustainability front in the many different definitions that you see, it's dramatic. Dramatic both in an absolute sense and dramatic relative to other industries, relative to other sectors. Recent reports supported by FAO, supported by GDP, showed that from 2005 to 2015, the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk globally had dropped 11%. And in the US, that drop was a more dramatic 20%. In fact, in the US, despite significant growth in milk production over that period of time, greenhouse gas emissions actually declined at an absolute level. So you're looking at an industry that is addressing its issues, creating tools at the level globally, at the level in the case of the US with the Innovation Center nationally, at the level of cooperatives like the one I work for in DFA, at the level of individual farms who are taking responsibility for their role in sustainability. So as an industry, we're relevant, we're impactful, we're responsible. There's a ton of positive things we can build from. It's not all just addressing the negatives that are hitting to us. The second question I was asked, beyond to question or pose or challenge the paper, was to suggest some policies that may be appropriate to discuss in later sessions. So we get the freedom to very loosely throw things out, and other people smarter have to give hard answers for it later. But I thought of a few policies that might be interesting to consider to help us with this evolution of where livestock, and particularly dairy, is. One that was captured as point number 5 on the previous speaker's presentation. We need as much as possible to get policymakers, certainly globally, as well as regionally and nationally, to look at the holistic impact of decisions they make. This idea that livestock is much more than just the end product that comes out. It's much more than a singular input. It's the effect it has more broadly. And I can mirror it to some things we would have seen in the agricultural sector and the food sector in the past. Dr. Greg Miller, who you met earlier today, has talked about it in the context of food. We went in the past away from people consuming food to increasingly consuming what's on the ingredient deck, what's on the guideline. And examples of unintended consequences: take out fat because fat must be bad. It doesn't get left empty. That gets filled up with things that bring back some of the flavor and mouthfeel that you lose. It brings back things like sugar. We make bad decisions based on looking at individual elements. And we see it today when we talk about plant versus animal. The issue is food systems. We have to think more holistically about what happens when you choose a food system. And again, everything I talk about is end. Whether it's inside the dairy structure, you talk about big farmers and small farmers. You talk about developing markets and developed markets. You talk about nutrition, you talk about indulgence. When we talk about feeding the world, it's not just dairy, it's not just livestock, it includes plant and synthetics and others. We need all of them to be competitive. But within that, we need to think of each of them in their total impact. So thinking more holistically about the choices we make, about the policies and what they do, needs to take that food system approach. The second policy I think we need to consider more is energy and the role that livestock can play as a provider of energy. In the US, and I'll touch on how it affects the world more broadly, you have time. I thought we had one less speaker, so you're going to let me keep rumbling.
We took that up with coffee.
First, I can't go to Washington, and now you're going to kill me. All right, someone should ask me about my policies so I can bring them up on the questions.
Thank you very much. Going off of what he said about asking questions, as a reminder, please submit all your questions, whether you have them on paper, write them on any piece of paper, or if you're using them electronically. This yellow sheet was given to you at registration, which you can use to find information to submit those questions. Our next speaker is Nitya Gotej. Nitya Gotej is one of the founders of Anthra and is presently its director. Besides being the director of Anthra, Nitya is also a veterinarian with specialization in veterinary surgery, where she has been working on issues related to development and environment. Nitya received her veterinary medicine degree with specialization in veterinarian surgery from Bombay Veterinary College. Let's please welcome Nitya to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Firstly, thank you to the GASL team, especially Fritz and Eduardo, for inviting me and making it possible for me to be here. Secondly, thank you to K-State for all the arrangements. And I must also thank Shirley for setting the tone for my presentation. You were helping me by setting the tone. So the presentation I have is Innovation in Action, Notes from the Field. I was asked to present innovations that our NGO Anthra is doing in India with small livestock farmers. So I'm going to take you now. How many of you have been to India? That's quite a few. Many of you haven't been to India, so here's a few pictures from the kinds of animals raised by Indians. Shirley set the tone. She took you around the world. I'm taking you only to one country. But it's a country which, besides being well populated, both with livestock and human beings, is also very diverse. So you have camels, you have cattle, you have goat, you have backyard poultry, you have buffalo, which is quite unique to India, largely, and of course also in Southeast Asia. And you have sheep and yak, and also actually elephants are domesticated. So we have diverse production systems there, ranging from industrial. Yes, we do have industrial poultry, and especially intensive, cooperative. India's has been the leader in the dairy cooperative movements. You've heard, we've been talking about this dairy sector. We have pastoral systems, extensive backyard, substances, small and micro. They provide livelihoods, employment, food, fiber, nutrition, and energy to millions of people. And as Shirley stated in her presentation, also education and to the family welfare and well-being. India is amongst the largest producers of milk, meat, and eggs in the world, produced by millions of farmers, not just a few. We have a situation where you have 2.9, we probably have something like that, not 2.9, maybe 3 or 4 animals per dairy farm, and maybe 20 to 30 chicken, or even 5 chicken a woman has in her backyard poultry unit. And in a world trying to reach goals of sustainable development, small livestock systems owners help achieve them. There's livelihoods, freedom from hunger. You also have many other goals of sustainable development being reached through livestock systems. But naturally, these systems are not without challenges, and innovations in small livestock rearing help farmers manage their animals better. About our NGO, Antra. We are a small NGO started by veterinarians in 1995. We have an all-women board with veterinarians, gender specialists, development specialists, doctors, and as members. We work mainly with poor and marginalized livestock rearing communities in India. We address challenges in participatory ways through community-based action research. And we find innovative solutions which are acceptable to the community, are enduring and sustainable. So the innovation that I've chosen is, it's actually probably also is with the animal health and welfare session, but I've looked at antimicrobial resistance, which today is a global problem, and because of it, there's a lot of loss to livestock and the economy. AMR is a particular concern in developing countries which bear the larger burden of where infectious diseases are high and spending on healthcare is low. India has amongst the largest burden of this problem. The burden is also felt by poor farmers who cannot afford to spend on veterinary medicine. Of course, AMR can be dealt with legislations. There are rules in place even in India, but they're difficult to implement. With better veterinary facilities, true, but it's a large country with a large population, also very difficult to reach out to. More research, lots is being done, but doesn't reach the poorest. Or by directly working with farmers and educating and working with them, which is what NGOs like ours does. So I have here with me a slide which says traditional yet innovative. So this is our experience using traditional knowledge which communities had on plant-based remedies to tackle the problem of AMR. So the challenge is legislations are difficult to implement, veterinary services are expensive and difficult to access. Livestock owners have started self-medicating, which is a huge problem because they don't have the resources and the money to pay for veterinary facilities. And you have several livestock owners who are just not educated and do not know about the consequences of AMR and the repeated and indiscriminate use of antibiotics. But we do have in India, fortunately, local and traditional knowledge with respect to plant-based medicines and phytotherapy, which is documented, validated, and disseminated widely. You have a codified system called Ayurveda, which many of you might be familiar with. So by giving additional training on improved management through animal health workers, we managed to control the incidences of AMR in the population. So livestock owners, for example, have, I think I just bring this here, this is easier. So livestock owners have decreased their dependence on antibiotics and other chemicals. Better management practices are in place with the training with the animal health workers. Livestock mortality and morbidity decreased, livestock production goes up, and better quality produce and livelihoods are more secure. So here I'm talking of a case study which we have is on mastitis. All of you who in the livestock sector are familiar with mastitis. It's a huge problem, also in developed countries. In India, it's especially a problem, especially where you have crossbred and exotic cows coming in and causes enormous economic losses. Dairy farmers are therefore trained in simple but effective hygienic milking practices as well as advised to feed the animals certain herbs such as Dinospora cordifolia or Asparagus racemosus, which are traditionally known to have antimicrobial properties. So this is a preventive. They are requested to use it as a top feed on the animal or the diet, as well as using simple remedies like Osmum sanctum, which is the holy basil, or turmeric, which is applied to the udder after milking. Both these also have antibacterial properties and are very simple, easy to access methods for farmers, especially poor farmers. It's been reported that farmers report lower incidence of mastitis. This knowledge has been shared with farmers all over the country, and trials with these herbs are also being done in the Netherlands with dairy farmers. Tomorrow, in fact, there's a presentation for the Natural Livestock Farming Group, which will share some of these trials which are being carried out in other countries. We have backyard poultry, diarrhea in backyard poultry, high mortality in backyard chicken, and frequent diseases. Again, training is given on better management, clean water, clean feed, good housing. And also, farmers are encouraged to feed herbs such as garlic to keep infections at bay. Turmeric, again, a well-known antibacterial, is added to drinking water once a week as a preventive. Farmers have found a reduction in morbidity and mortality. The production has gone up. Quality of the produce goes up. Nutrition security of the household also goes up, and women rearing backyard poultry have better incomes. And Newcastle disease vaccinations are also recommended along with this. It's not without this, but we also recommend vaccination. So we have a third one, which is abortion in ewes, which is in sheep, which is a big problem. Because of lack of diagnostic facilities, shepherds are unable, or even veterinarians do not know what exactly is the cause of this. It could be a zoonotic disease. But because it's difficult to get diagnostic facilities in time when the problem happens, farmers often panic. They sell diseased animals in the market very quickly, and this can be a further public health disaster. So for this, we've advised our shepherds to continue using, to actually start giving their animals herbs such as Andrographis paniculata, Asparagus racemosus, and Tinospora cordifolia. All these are quite well known to farmers because they're available in the environment. They know them with their local names, and they're able to access them and make simple powders. They're also trained in keeping their surroundings clean and getting rid of waste material. So you have simple remedies for them. And we found that there has been a decrease in these. So added to this, we also have other problems, which is several farmers, as I've said, live in very remote areas with low accessibility to knowledge. I mean, to the normal communication channels, which is the newspapers, they can't read, or to television. Several not literate, and they depend on others to read for them. So you have a community of farmers who really are not very well educated, cannot read. So how does knowledge get to them? They don't have the time to attend get extension messages or even attend meetings very frequently. They have limited access to veterinary facilities, are unable to take critical and timely decisions related to the animals. If there's an outbreak, should you or should you not vaccinate your animals? How do these decisions get taken? So this is an innovation which we've called modern and mobile. Everybody now owns a mobile phone. Everybody wants to own a mobile phone in most continents. In India, definitely it's a big thing to own a mobile phone, and it's an easy and simple way of getting valid information across very quickly. So it could be related to disease outbreaks, weather conditions, fodder availability, and market information. And there's another, if you look at www.accessagriculture.org, is a site where small and simple videos on livestock care have been uploaded. They also have videos on agriculture, which are easy for farmers belonging to very marginal backgrounds to follow. Farmers are also taught to access weather information, news on their mobiles, and WhatsApp groups have been shared between shepherds and farmers to share information in real time. So the information which was not reaching people who are on the move constantly or in distant places, this has been a very, very useful tool for us to use. So farmers, shepherds, and livestock owners are able to access information easily and take timely decisions, which is very important. Prevent epidemics, get their animals to the market on time, and also help during disasters. We've had floods recently in India with very heavy monsoon rains. It's been very, very easy then to get information across to farmers about what they're expected to do, how to do it, and what kind of benefits the government could reach out to them. So here we have several farmers using the mobile, and if you see the last one, someone's got a solar panel hitched to his back. So this is not our innovation, but it's one of the innovations which is taking place. So about our innovation, they're easy and simple to use. They're inexpensive, relatively inexpensive. The mobile phones are bought by the shepherds themselves or the farmers. They're nested in local knowledge systems, so we're not looking for exotic technology or knowledge. They have a wide range of applicability and replicability. They've been developed along with the farmers in a participatory way, so they're easily accepted. And finally, they help small farmers improve their livelihoods and economic base. We're also going to be sharing a little more about NGO innovations this afternoon in a session on I think it's room number 12, isn't it? Session D, parallel session. So we invite you to hear more about innovations from other NGOs. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Gotesh. Our final speaker, Mr. Juan Jose Molina, will provide some additional perspective. Mr. Molina is a veterinarian and rancher and is a member of the 9th generation of the Molina family and runs the family's El Jacito Natural Reserve outside of Cali, Colombia. He's also an associate researcher with the Center for Research on Sustainable Agricultural Systems. He manages the Altajicos dairy production using intensive silvopastoral systems and also produces sugarcane. Both his dairy and sugarcane crops are managed under agroecological principles and are organically certified. Please welcome Mr. Molina to the stage.
Okay, good morning. Thank you to the organizers. As the presenter said, I come here to represent El Atico Nature Reserve. It's a family project. It's a family project that has been running now for 9 generations, and I'm going to refer to the sustainable livestock production in the tropic, based on agroecological principles and the use of SDGs along searching for a sustainable production. Now let's talk about some background information. El Atico Nature Reserve is located in Colombia, in the Cauca Valley, with an altitude of 1,000 meters over sea level, an average temperature of 24 degrees, with an annual rainfall of 750 millimeters, and a relative humidity of 75%. It is located or described as dry tropical rainforest according to Holdridge classification. Let's see how the ecosystem evolved through time. In this picture, in 1942, the basic productive system was extensive livestock production, where you can see some relic forest. By the early 70s, sugarcane crops become really popular in the region, changing the landscape dramatically. Internally in the farm, we also introduced sugarcane crops, but in the livestock area, it is really important to highlight that we stimulated natural regeneration, increasing canopy coverture and pioneer trees appearance. In 1994, we did the first study regarding to soil quality, and we measured organic matter content. And it was clear to see how the soil was decreasing in its quality in the different land uses. So we were in the need for a change. So we started using, for the last 2 decades, some agroecological principles, which basically look to integrate livestock, forestry, and agriculture as a unit to potentialize their effects and try to be sustainable socially, environmentally, and economically. Finally, providing some healthy products for our community. This is the image of how our system looks nowadays. At the beginning of the 90s, we started establishing the intensive silvopastoral systems, and this had a really big effect, improving the density of shrubs and trees at a paddock level. It is also really important to highlight how the matrix of the forest is nowadays immersed in between the area of the livestock, which has provided us a really important effect on water regulation. So let's talk about the impact of intensive silvopastoral systems. First of all, I want to define the intensive silvopastoral systems as agroforestry arrangements of fodder plants, grasses, leguminous herbs, shrubs, and trees that work together to improve animal nutrition and complementary uses. I'm going to refer to 6 components which measure the impact of intensive silvopastoral systems. The first component, soil recovery, going back to the study we did in 1994, compared with the situation in 2012, after 18 years of adoption, we can see how the soil recovers in terms of organic matter. We had an interesting improvement, and it reflects over productivity in the case of pastures and in the case of sugarcane crops. It is really important to see that by every point you increase in organic matter in the soil content, 15 liters per square meter of soil are accumulated. By the other side, we did another investigation to show the importance of trees in the productive system, comparing different silvopastoral systems in different stages and the effect of trees over organic matter content. Here we can see the values outside the tree canopy compared with the situation under the tree canopy. As you can clearly see, the role of trees is very important, stimulating macro and microorganisms activity and potentiating biomass productivity. In the second component, I'm going to talk about climate change. Here is a research we did comparing grass monoculture diet with intensive silvopastoral systems. And what we found is that there was a reduction of 30% in the methane emissions. Basically, having a more efficient diet which allow us to reduce these emissions. In terms of biodiversity, this study we compared worm density in the two seasons, humid season and dry season. And the most important thing to see is that the worm density is even in both cases, showing resilience behavior. In terms of animal welfare, we did a study valuing feeding, housing, health, and behavior, starting from the baseline situation, compared with the intensive silvopastoral system, and you can see the clear improvement. This is the situation of our cows in the natural conditions, grazing in an intensive silvopastoral system. And the social impact, well, it is really important to highlight the quality employment for our collaborators and for the people in our region. By the other side, there is a group of herederos silvopastoriles, that is a group of young people that we seek to motivate to work in the farms, developing more tools so that they can develop productive projects and sustainable projects in their farms. Another clear example is the Colombian Sustainable Livestock Project, where you can see some numbers of the effect of this project. And basically, the proposal is to achieve social, environmental, and economic transformation of livestock, looking for a single well-being. Finally, in quality and healthy products, last year we came to the market with organic certified products. These are the first organic certified products from dairy in Colombia, and it has been a big step due to 30 years of innovation. It is important to highlight that organic products are not a goal for us, but a consequence of the productive system. In terms of resilience, these 6 components reflect clearly over it, and in this graph you can see a clear behavior of the last 10 years in terms of climate change compared with the productivity behavior. And the most important thing is to highlight is how stable the production is along the years, even though the climate changes. In terms of productivity, I would like to compare both situations, monoculture versus intensive silvopastoral systems, and what are our conditions nowadays. So it is important to highlight that the area reduces, even though the productivity increases. You can see how supplementation and mineralized salt reduce compared with the monoculture, and in terms of cost of fertilizers, and irrigation reduces to 0. Finally, to have a profit, which is really interesting in this case. Finally, it is really important to see how agroecological productive systems contribute to more than one SDG. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Molina. Now, at this time, as promised, we will pose the questions that have been asked from the audience before the panel. To begin, Mr. Waldvogel, we apologize for having to cut you off. Would you please continue on with your thoughts about policy?
Yeah, you should never apologize for cutting me off. There are many, many people who just should have done that a long, long time ago. I just want to talk about some of the policies specifically that have been thought through, and beautifully described again this idea of holistically looking at how we impact the environment, how we impact socially, how we impact the market by the decisions that we take, and beautifully laid out in that last example. The other ones I thought were interesting to discuss were energy. I think in the US there's lots of advances in how you look at manure that comes from livestock systems to create energy. But very often those are penalized by the current energy system. They're not rewarded or incentivized enough. We find many farmers who are successful, but they tend to have to bring in other organic matter. They make money by getting tipping fees from other companies more than a manure. And the reason I think energy policies are important is when you have them developed at scale in one market, they can then be downsized and used in others. We see already today in the US farms as low as 200 cows that are quite successful using these systems. When you can put them onto smaller herds, they become valuable around the world. Policies around carbon credits we think are important. The issue around consumers willing to pay more, consumers willing to pay for carbon sequestration, for some of these issues around how you manage your farms in a way they view as more sustainable. There's value in that. And we know for a fact in the US the science and technologies available today to create net zero farms already. But when you can create a value proposition for the producer, that will go that much faster. And I think both the energy and carbon credit policies are examples of where we have tried to beat the industry into submission. We have penalized them for not being good actors, when in fact if we use the carrot approach and reward for these things, I think you'll see those taken up very quickly and be very positive for livestock and sustainability. And then around trade, I think one of the things we miss a lot is this idea of how technology can trade. We see lots of examples of where countries and economies didn't stop and reintroduce copper lines on telephones. They went right to the smartphone. But there's more practical examples of where these developing markets don't have access to basic technology for processing equipment, for manufacturing equipment, that given would speed up the development of their industries. And I think those are the ones that we had thought about that might be also useful policies that can affect us all in a positive way. And thank you for indulging me in the extra time.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Ms. Tarawali. The investment for digital platforms, cell phone and internet, focus on population density, which basically de-incentivizes rural investment. How can we best address the building of digital infrastructure for innovation usage to support sustainable livestock production?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, and it's definitely not my area. I think the point that I was making there was, for example, with some of the things that we see going on, for example, with insurance that's based on mobile phone technology, we see things going on that's supporting genetic improvement and recording based on mobile phone technology that allows you to reach either people that are quite marginalized spatially, they're away from the towns, or it allows you to engage with many, many hundreds or so of different farmers, and so you get a very rich data source. And those require some of these other things like mobile phones and internet coverage and so on to work. And for that to happen, of course, it requires engagement of a much wider policy sector. It's not just about agriculture. It's about those who are supporting that wider set of infrastructure. But I don't think that answers the question. I'm just telling you what I was talking about.
Thank you. The next question is from Ms. Gotej. How many farmers are benefiting from anthro work, and if you believe the anthro-driven practices can be scaled up to a country level? How can Indian farmers eventually adopt the identified good practices?
I've been working on this issue for several years now, so I think I would have impacted thousands, if not several thousand farmers in the way that we've been sharing our knowledge and beliefs. But as I said, India is a very large country, so we might have trained some farmers 10 or 5 years back, and then you find that in a little while, there's a new generation of farmers who've come and they need training constantly. So it's work that needs to be done continuously. And you can't, there's no clear time period within which it can be finished. But what would be of importance is to have some of these things entering perhaps the veterinary curriculum. Veterinary curriculums in many countries have been and I'm sitting in a veterinary college right now, have for the past 25 years have been dismissive of phytotherapy. I know this from conversations with my veterinary colleagues in Europe, for example. So it would be good if there was a little more respect given to phytotherapy and these kinds of systems of medicine as being the first line of treatment which farmers can use, especially in low and middle income countries, rather than having very aggressive kinds of treatment for animals such as this. That's what I would share, that it needs to enter the veterinary curriculum system and perhaps even into policy to be scaled up much more, where the livestock policy of the country is supportive of these kinds of initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, for Mr. Molina. Have you seen adoption of silvopastoral practices in farms neighboring your farm? Are you seeing spread of practices at a larger scale? If not, why do you think this isn't happening?
Okay, well, in our particular case, due to our location and sugarcane importance, well, it has been a little bit difficult in the Cauca Valley, the adoption of intensive silvopastoral systems. But in the country, as I showed in the presentation, we can see it has been having quite a nice impact. And the idea is to continue in this way of production. In the case of organic production, we have been capable of increasing the value for the milk of litter, and nowadays, in terms of economical balance, we are more or less even with the sugarcane crop. So it is an interesting opportunity for the producers that want to implement this kind of production.
Thank you. These were our questions submitted. Mr. Waldvogel, why is the widespread demise of dairy farmers in the US, Europe, and India elsewhere not being addressed? Is this not an aspect of sustainability?
It's absolutely an aspect of sustainability. I think the question we have to ask is it different than what we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years? My family farm fell into its demise 35 years ago, and it was simply a matter of whether we were economically viable, we were prepared to invest in the future or not. So I think there's a normal evolution of marketplaces. I would suggest that we're currently going through a period in the US that is abnormal. It's a bit too aggressive. But when you look at the future of agriculture, you look at the future of dairy farming, you have to be realistic about what that future is that fits the needs. What is sustainable is not exactly what your grandfather did. So I think it's being addressed, but it's being addressed consistent with how history evolves as opposed to how we necessarily want history to be preserved.
Thank you. Are there questions?
If you don't mind, since you let me speak earlier, I'll just keep rambling on.
Please do.
Connecting that to an earlier conversation about digitization and some of the issues that you've heard from other panelists, one of the most important things for us, not just in new markets, but in existing markets, is how do you get new farmers interested? How do you get them thinking, I want to be a farmer, whether that's poultry or swine or dairy? Part of it is showing them the farming of the future, which isn't the farming that they have been accustomed to. It's not, you should be a farmer because you work hard and you get up early. You should be a farmer because it's an incredibly engaged, technical, innovative job that offers all kinds of opportunities to do wonderful things. And part of the demise of farming in many places, and dairy farming in particular, is we haven't done well enough in painting those options and those futures that fit the farmers of the future.
Thank you for that. Question for Ms. Gotesh. In the USA, we have a problem with false, misleading information running rampant through our social media. Are Indian farmers having to deal with false information also?
Definitely yes. I mean, I learn about social media more from my children than I know myself, but I believe there is something called TikTok, and it can be quite not very nice and there is a lot of unnecessary information that does get shared on social media. But here, when we're talking about the messages that we share, I think farmers who get information from us know it's from a trusted source. They know it's somebody they can rely on and look forward to the messages we send them regularly. And it's a fairly close group in the WhatsApp group of people that we connect with. It's only 2 people. But for sure, the social media can be very dangerous.
Well, with that, let's get a round of applause for all of our panelists. I want to thank them for their time and commitment to the GASL group. With that, I appreciate you letting me be your facilitator today, and I will turn it over to Susan.
Thank you. As Garrett was leaving, we had one final question that we were going to pose for the panelists, but then close the session. But because I think it's very apropos, Garrett being a sophomore here at Kansas State University, the question was related to how can we encourage more youth in agriculture? So maybe if the panelists wanted to take an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, it is really important to have the link since a very early age, no? And dignify the rural production. So in this case, it is important to share with the young people all the alternatives, the sustainable ways to produce. And it is clear, it is a key element in our case to value what we call the natural capital. Instead of having a higher dependency on inputs, we try to reduce this dependency. And in this way, the system can turn to be more profitable. It is also important to see the local conditions and potentialize the resources that we have in each region so that young ones have the opportunity to improve their conditions.
I think for too long, farming has been portrayed as a job, as you said, of being drudgery, of being backbreaking, of being non-remunerative. Farmers are looked at as being backward, socially backward, uneducated, illiterate, and I think that's been the problem of how they've been pictured and painted for many years now. I think if farming has to progress and look good, and we do need farmers for the future, I think the whole image that one paints of farmers and livestock keepers has to change. It has to look at something that's being progressive, looking into the future. People, as you said, who are engaged in meaningful work, feeding the world, actually, and also helping in other sectors like maintaining biodiversity, helping the environment, contributing positively to climate change. I think these are the images that need to be, the narrative has to change. These are the images we need for the farming community. It's only then that the younger generation will want to come into farming. Having said this, there will be a natural exit process, I think, from farming families. Farming families cannot, given the land availability, I don't think a family, you can't keep having land becoming more fragmented, or even livestock numbers getting more fragmented. So there will be a consolidation, probably a sustainable level where it has to break even. But for that, I think the narrative has to change about farmers. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me build a little bit on that. I think it's about making the sector very attractive. And I think part of that is that this is a sector that's growing incredibly fast across much of the world. Maybe not here so much, but in the developing world, certainly. And there's huge opportunities for IT, for technology, new things that many of our young people are interested in not only learning about, but deploying to be part of those solutions to a more efficient, productive sector. In many cases as well, perhaps here that's more the case, there's opportunities for some niche products, opportunities to be part of these specialty products that are becoming increasingly of interest to consumers. You're addressing issues about health and about environment, about antimicrobials or whatever it might be, and producing a very tailored product as well. And for this to happen as well, there needs to be some thought given to opportunities around things like credit and financing, access to land and so on, that maybe in some cases youth could be disadvantaged. And so we need to make sure that those are quite equitable as well.
I go back to something I said earlier, which is it's almost natural as humans, but it seems to fall even heavier into agriculture, and maybe it's part of this, you work hard in the drudgery. We're really good at identifying the negative. We're really good at beating down the problem. We're not so good about talking about the positive, about the things that we really do, the positive influences we have on society. I think when you put that in context to young people today, and if I were to talk to someone who's just about to graduate from university or has been out in the world a couple years and now is trying to figure out their career, if you go back 50 years ago and that person is sitting in front of you and they ask, where can I have a career that is exciting, that is going to be stimulating for me, going to create wealth for me, you might have said plastics. Someone's seen the movie. You jump to the 1980s and you might have said, oh, computers. 1990s, you might have said software. 2000s, you might have said telecommunications. 2010, you might have said applications. Today, you ask that question, where is there a career that I can feel good about, that I can have a career in, that I can create wealth? Agriculture. The solutions to the problems that face us today are underneath our feet, are at our fingertips in agriculture. We just need to sell it and promote it in that positive way as opposed to beat them down with the negative.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Please.